So the first theory I want to talk about is utilitarianism. Now you guys will probably notice the reading I had you do is actually on consequentialism. And consequentialism, well, consequentialism is a family of theories, and utilitarianism is actually a kind of consequentialist theory. There are other consequentialist moral theories besides utilitarianism. You guys won't really need to know about them. They're not that important. Utilitarianism is really the most important sort of consequentialist theory. So as your reading pointed out, to call a theory consequentialist is to say it evaluates, it judges actions in terms of their consequences. And I'm going to bet that a lot of you have approached issues from a consequentialist perspective. And if you haven't, it's a form of moral thinking that comes pretty naturally. And let me give you guys a case that I think will trigger probably a consequentialist way of moral thinking. Imagine that you see a train barreling down the tracks and it's going to run over 5 people. I don't know why they can't get out of the way, but let's just assume they can't. You know, philosophers' examples are often a little weird. For some reason, these 5 people can't get out of the way of the train. Now you could switch the train to another track where it'll run over 1 person. What would you likely do? What do you think the right thing to do is? And why? Well, I think for most of us, you know, we probably hope we'll never be in this situation, but most of us would switch the trains to the track with the 1 person. Why is that? Well, you switch the train, 1 person dies. If you don't, 5 die, right? Better consequences where only 1 person dies than if 5 die. Or let's take another case, maybe, you know, not so in the moment, not so stressful. Imagine that you're a planner and you're trying to decide where to build a road. And if you build it in one place, it's going to be very curvy, very dangerous. You won't have to tear down anybody's house to build it, but it'll be dangerous, and your projections say that probably 2 or 3 people a year will die in a wreck. You could build the road in another place. You'd have to tear down, let's say, 4 people's houses, but the road will be much safer. Probably in your projections say only 1 person will die every 10 years. You know, where would you build the road? I think you'd build it in the second place. Why? Because, you know, destroying a few houses is definitely worth saving that many lives over time, right? Better consequences. We reach for consequentialist reasoning all the time. You know, maybe even a more trivial example, imagine that I want Vietnamese food, but everybody with me absolutely hates it. They wouldn't eat it. I don't like Chinese food as well, but, you know, I like it well enough. So what would we do? We'd choose the Chinese restaurant. Why? Better consequences, everybody pretty happy, better than 1 person really happy and let's say 10 people miserable. All right, so that's the basic thought of consequentialism. But you guys have probably noticed that this talk of good and bad consequences is pretty vague, right? You know, sometimes we have a really clear idea of what are good consequences, what are bad consequences. A lot of times we don't. You know, imagine your option is, and again, this is outlandish, but imagine your option is 2 people on 1 track, they're both very old. 1 person on the other track, they're 20 years old. Would you let the train run over 2 70-year-old people, or would you save the 20-year-old person? Much harder to know here, right? These examples get a little harder as I get older, you know. But so how would you decide what to do? Or imagine you could, you know, you see 2 people drowning, you can only save 1 person. Who do you save? 1 person is, you know, let's say a brilliant scientist, the other is just a random guy. Well, you'd probably save the brilliant scientist, but how exactly do you account for thinking that's better consequences, saving this 1 person than saving this other person? Well, utilitarianism is a way to make this idea of good and bad consequences more exact. So the utilitarian says good consequences are consequences that bring about the most happiness. And the utilitarian gives us a pretty exact definition of what he means by happiness, For the utilitarian, happiness is pleasure and the absence of pain. And they mean these terms in the widest possible sense. Pleasure is anything that people enjoy. Pain is anything that people find unpleasant. So eating a great meal, well, that's pleasure. That's a pleasant physical sensation. But so is reading a book if I enjoy it, right? So is, if I enjoy playing chess, then playing chess is, for me, a pleasure. I had one student once who, and this is very odd, but I guess she's lucky, she told me she got pleasure out of doing her accounting homework, so for her, that's pleasure. Pain, on the other hand, is, yes, physical pain, so a headache would be pain, a toothache would be pain, but it's also anything that people find unpleasant that they want to avoid. So emotional pains like boredom would count, fear would count, sadness would count. So pain and pleasure in the widest sense of the term, that's what happiness is for the utilitarian. So for the utilitarian, the right thing to do, the morally right thing to do, is whatever brings about the greatest overall happiness. And by overall happiness, they mean everyone's happiness in the long term. And it's really important you keep in mind that for a utilitarian, when they talk about happiness being pleasure in the absence of pain, they mean pleasure in the absence of pain in the long term. So, some people will say, well, obviously we can do things that aren't good for us that we find pleasurable. Let's say trying heroin or something like that, right? Isn't utilitarianism stupid because they'd say we should all try heroin? Well, no, right? Because if you do heroin, you're very likely to be addicted. It might give you a lot of pleasure now, but it's going to bring about more pain in the long term. So for the utilitarian, it wouldn't be a good decision. They almost think of these things in financial terms. Pleasure is the black number or the number in the positive. Pain is the minus number or the number in the negative. You subtract the pain from the pleasure. And you want the number to be as high as possible. So doing things that bring you a lot of pleasure now, but a lot of pain in the future, that's like running up a big bill on your credit card. You're going to have to pay it off at some point. In the long term, the pain is going to outweigh the pleasure. Now, another objection people always level at utilitarianism is they say, well, what about people who enjoy pain? I'll keep this PG rated. I won't go into a lot of detail, but you guys can, imagine. Well, here's what the utilitarian says. They'll say, well, of course, some people enjoy pain, but here's the thing. For them, they get more pleasure. They get a greater payout from the pain, right? So for them, the pain is like an investment that pays off in pleasure. So pleasure and the absence of pain in the long term, that's what the utilitarian thinks happiness is. And the utilitarian will say, well, whose happiness should we care about? Well, we should care about everybody's. If you're a utilitarian, the right thing to do isn't just what brings you happiness. The right thing to do is whatever brings about the greatest overall happiness, which is everybody's happiness in the long term. So how do we figure out what's going to bring about the greatest overall happiness, the greatest pleasure, and the least pain in the long term? Well, remember, we treat pleasure as the positive number, pain as the negative number, and we ask ourselves 4 questions about the pleasures and pains. How intense are they? How long do they last? How many people do they affect? And how likely are they? Imagine if you're a utilitarian that you could do something that will make hundreds of people a little unhappy and one person blissfully happy. Well, the utilitarian might very well say you should make the one person blissfully happy because there's more intensity even if less people are affected, right? So you have to figure out how great it is, how long it's going to last, how many people it will affect, and then finally likelihood. The utilitarian knows that in the real world, we can't always be sure of what's going to happen because of our actions, but we often have a pretty good idea. We often know what's likely to happen, right? So you have to factor the likelihood in. Okay, so this all might be a little mysterious to you. Let's apply it to some real cases. Let's see why the utilitarian would reach some of the judgments that he would about some common sense cases. So let's think about killing another human being. We all hopefully think that it's wrong to kill another human being. Well, how would the utilitarian give us an account of why it's generally wrong to kill another person? Well, think about it. If you kill another person, it's very likely, it's almost certain, that you're depriving them of what would have been a pleasant life for them on the whole. So, you deprive that person of all future pleasure, that counts against killing somebody. Well, most people have family and friends, so it's very likely your action is going to make their family and friends really unhappy, create a lot of pain for them, deprive them of a lot of pleasure. Then you have to factor in the fact that if you kill another person, well, there's always a decent chance that you'll get caught. So it has a good likelihood of bringing pretty intense and pretty long-lasting pain to you as well if you go to jail and you're there the rest of your life, right? So that's the account the utilitarian would give for why it's generally wrong to kill another human being. Well, what about, say, stealing? Why is stealing usually wrong? Why would a utilitarian say that? Well, they would say that stealing is usually wrong because even though you steal something that might bring you a little bit of happiness, it's going to create a lot of unhappiness from the person you stole from. Not only that, the utilitarian will say, well, the intensity of the unhappiness from the person you steal from is greater than the intensity of the happiness you'll get, or it's very likely to be. Not only that, when you steal, you likely affect a lot of people, right? I remember I had my window broken and stuff stolen on my car. Well, this didn't just affect me. Everybody who lived on my block saw, well, my car's been broken into. Now they're worried. They think their cars are going to be next, right? So you think about, well, you might get some pleasure from stealing, but the pain you're going to cause the other person is going to be more intense, and it's going to affect more people by making other people worry about getting their stuff stolen. Now you might be thinking, well, of course it's not always wrong to kill another person, and of course it's not always wrong to steal, but the utilitarian can account for this. When is it right to kill, or when is it not wrong to kill another human being? Well, an example might be self-defense, right? Imagine there's an axe murderer at your door. He's chopping through the door with his axe. Your only option is to say shoot him. Well, a utilitarian would say that's the right thing to do. It's likely to have the best consequences. One person's going to die. Well, if one person's going to die, it's a good chance that by killing the axe murderer, you'll create less misery than if he kills you, right? If he kills you, well, you're dead. But if you kill him, on the other hand, well, think about what each of you are likely to do. None of us hopefully are going to go about axe murdering people. So, likely consequences of us living, we experience the nice, pleasurable life we would have had. We don't do anything to harm others. If this axe murderer gets away, pretty good chance that he's going to go out and kill more people. That's going to create a lot more pain. So on balance, by self-defense, that's going to create the most pleasure, or at least prevent the most pain. It's likely the axe murderer would cause a lot more pain than you will just going about your life. And what about stealing? Well, sometimes stealing will be okay. Imagine stealing bread to keep from dying. Well, if that's the case, then the utilitarian would say, well, then steal. Why? The intensity of the pain you would feel starving to death is going to be much greater than the intensity of the pain somebody will feel because they have, say, a loaf of bread stolen from them, right? Even if they're Scrooge, even if they're really unhappy to have their bread stolen, they might be a little unhappy. They're not going to be as unhappy, it's not going to be as painful as if you die, right? And think about it, the duration is not going to be that long. Even Scrooge probably couldn't stay unhappy that his bread was stolen for more than a day or two, right? If you starve to death, that's going to be a long, drawn-out process that'll take a lot of time, and once you die, it will affect a lot of people. So the utilitarian could give us, not only do they have a good account of why killing is usually wrong or why stealing is usually wrong, they have a pretty good account of why we make exceptions to these rules. Okay, so this brings us to, hopefully you guys can understand utilitarianism. If you don't, please do email me any questions you might have. This brings us to the advantages and disadvantages of utilitarianism. Now, it has some noticeable advantages, and I think a big one is its common sense starting point. Utilitarianism doesn't need any controversial claims to get off the ground. So what do I mean by that? Well, contrast utilitarianism, its starting point, it would say, well, pain is bad. Pleasure is good. Think about how your own pain feels. Think about how your own pleasure feels. If your pain's bad and your pleasure's good, you should admit the same thing for others. Their pleasure is good, their pain is bad. That's not really controversial. I hope most of us would agree with it. Contrast that with somebody, who says, well, you should do this because it's the will of God, right? Well, someone who says you should do this because it will make other people happy, or you shouldn't do this because it causes needless pain, that's much less controversial than you should do this or you shouldn't do this because it's the will of God, right? Way more controversial claim, much harder to get it off the ground, much easier for people to disagree with you. Utilitarianism, just saying pain is bad, pleasure is good, much more commonsensical, most people will agree with it. Second advantage of utilitarianism, it does a good job accounting for many of our normal moral judgments, many of the judgments that we're sure about. And you want a moral theory to, for the most part, fit with our moral judgments, to fit with our moral reasoning. Look, I'm going to bet you guys already think like utilitarians for a lot of day-to-day cases anyway, right? It can be something as big as triage in wartime or as small as who to give concert tickets to, right? You leave it this way, right? If you're in war, we all think you should probably, if you can only save, you can either save one person or save three, you should save the three. Utilitarianism would give us a good answer to that. Why? Because by saving three, you're preventing more pain, bringing about greater pleasure. Or imagine I have some concert tickets to give away. I can give them to one person who doesn't really care about the band, but kind of likes going to shows, or I can give them to another who absolutely loves the band. Probably give them to the person who absolutely loves it, all other things being equal. Why? Well, again, utilitarianism has a good answer. It brings about the most overall happiness, gives that person more pleasure than it would to give to the person who doesn't care about this band as much, right? All right, final thing, and this is a big advantage of utilitarianism, is that it promises exact answers to controversial cases. In fact, it seems like utilitarianism could turn morality almost into a science. Utilitarians will say, well, think about what makes people happy, and then think about how to get people the most of what will make them happy. Or think about what makes people unhappy, then figure out how to make sure they don't have to endure the stuff that makes them unhappy. The utilitarian will say, you don't really need any fancy moral theory. You could, in fact, just do social science. Do psychology, figure out what makes people happy and unhappy, then do some economics, figure out how to get them the most of the stuff that makes them happy. Now, I think a lot of philosophers don't like this about utilitarianism. They think, well, it'll turn morality into a social science. It'll put us out of work. But I actually think this is a huge advantage. Utilitarianism promises a lot in resolving controversial cases. That seems like a good thing. And I'll give you guys an example of how this might work. Take the issue of physician-assisted suicide. we can have an endless moral debate about physician-assisted suicide. You might think it's acceptable because it eases the pain of a terminally ill person who's dying anyway, who wants to die. I might argue, well, it's not acceptable. Think about, the duties of doctors. Doctors take an oath not to harm others. Think about the sacredness of human life. We shouldn't kill other people. We could go around and around about the debate, but if you approach it as a utilitarian, you get a pretty exact answer pretty quickly, right? These people want to die. They don't have a lot of time left. If they go on living, they've judged that their, continued life will be very painful for them. So by allowing physicians to help the terminally ill die, we would spare them a lot of pain. So the utilitarian would say do it. Now with this case, you can also see one of the more cold-blooded parts of utilitarian reasoning. Because utilitarian would say use our resources where they create the most happiness. Well, take the issue of physician-assisted suicide for the terminally ill. Using our medical resources, money, drugs, doctors and nurses' time on the terminally ill, that's probably not going to be the best investment. We could buy, put that in scare quotes, more happiness by using those resources elsewhere. So for both those sets of reasons, utilitarianism would say, well, no problem with physician-assisted suicide. So I'm using that as an example. Hopefully you understand how the utilitarian reasoning would let us resolve the debate, how it applies to this case. Well, so of course there are some disadvantages of utilitarianism. If there weren't, we wouldn't really go on any further. It's like, well, utilitarianism would be the only moral theory you need. But there's some disadvantages, and I think these disadvantages, sometimes utilitarian reasoning will work pretty well, but in some cases it won't, and it won't because of these disadvantages or problems. So I think there are three main disadvantages of utilitarianism, and I want to explain each of these in a bit more detail. So the first of these is that utilitarianism doesn't do well with fairness. Well, look, think about it this way. Most of us think that fairness is very important. We should treat people in a fair way. But the utilitarian doesn't care about fairness as such. The utilitarian only cares about what brings about the most happiness, most pleasure, least pain. And now usually being fair will be the way to create the most overall happiness. Imagine, I'll give you an example. Imagine that you're dividing up some cake among like 5 children. If you're doing that, you want to be really fair in the way you divide the cake up. Why? Kids care about fairness. If you're unfair, well, probably one kid or more than one kid is going to create quite a fuss. You're not going to be happy, and no one else is going to be happy. So usually the utilitarian will say that we should act in ways that are fair because being fair will create the most overall happiness. People don't like it when we're not fair. But in some cases, utilitarians just won't do well with fairness at all. Sometimes acting unfairly might create the greatest happiness. I'll give you guys an example. Once, way back many years ago, in a class I was teaching, I had a really problematic student. This isn't at TCC, so it doesn't reflect on Tidewater. I won't say where it was. I'm greatly tempted to, but I won't. So this student failed my class. Why'd she fail? Well, the grades were mainly taken from 4 exams. She didn't bother to show up for one of them, and she left halfway through another one, didn't finish it, I don't know why, and failed the other 2 because she didn't study. So she fails my class. Actually, she gets a D, which is, not bad considering how little work she did, but still not a passing grade. So she gets a D. I think no more about giving her a D. I go home for Christmas. I get a bunch of emails from her, which I noticed the day after Christmas. Just email after email after email. She's obviously incredibly unhappy that she got a D in my class. one of the most outrageous things I've ever heard from a student. In fact, she says that I personally ruined Christmas. Let that sink in for a minute. I don't know. I think that's funny, but I've ruined Christmas. And she keeps sending email after email. Apparently the only way that I can salvage New Year's is to give her a passing grade in my class. I don't do this. Why? Because I don't think it's fair. She got the grade she earned. Plenty of people did as bad as she did. They didn't complain. They just accepted it. Plenty of people did better because they worked. It would be unfair to give her a grade she didn't earn, that she doesn't deserve. But she keeps on with this. She is just an incredible pain in my neck. She won't let up, email after email. Eventually, she gets her mom to come down from Northern Virginia and talk to the chair of our department. Just so much hassle for so many people. Now look, I think that a utilitarian would say to change her grade. You know, if I change her grade, I'm no longer going to have to dread opening my email. Mother will not have to come down from Northern Virginia. And the department chair can do whatever it is he did in his office. He says research. I strongly suspect playing video games. But either way, it would be happier than talking to Mother, right? But look, even though it would create the most happiness, I'm not going to change the grade, and I'm not going to change the grade because I don't think it would be fair to. The utilitarian just can't deal with that. That might be a problem with their theory. We'll talk about more about this fairness issue when we talk about Rawls and Nozick and distributive justice. They'll both fault utilitarianism because it's not so good with fairness. Okay. Second problem with utilitarianism, doesn't do well with respect for persons, and it might not be a good foundation for rights. What do I mean by this? Well, I think most of us think that there are certain things we should never do to another person no matter what. We shouldn't do this to another person even if it might have good consequences. I'll give you an example. Imagine that you are a doctor and you have a patient come in. He's homeless, he's not living so well, you don't think he's going to do well in the long term, and you notice he's an organ donor. You think to yourself, well, I'm smart. I can figure out a way to kill this guy and won't get caught, and where his organs are okay. Then we could cut him up, take his organs, and I could save 5 people. Now, hopefully none of you are listening to this and thinking, oh, maybe we should cut this guy up. Hopefully you're thinking, oh my goodness, that's outrageous. Don't cut this poor man up. Why? Because you think that no matter what the consequences might be, it would be wrong to murder another human being for his organs. People deserve respect. They shouldn't be treated in that way. Well, the problem is, it seems hard for the utilitarian to say that. This guy's life isn't going so well. There's only one of him. You can kill him and save the lives of, let's say, 5 people who are going to live pretty good lives. More people saved, they'll have more happiness in their lives. Why not kill this guy? Well, of course you shouldn't kill this guy. It seems utilitarianism just gives us the wrong answer here. It might make us worry about, using utilitarianism in cases where rights are important to us. Now the utilitarian will have an answer. They'll say, well, if you kill this guy, you might get caught. If it gets out that doctors are killing people for their organs, you're going to go to jail. Nobody's going to want to donate organs. That'll create so much unhappiness. And yes, that might be true, but look, that's just not a very good answer as to why you shouldn't kill people for their organs, right? If I say to you, you shouldn't kill people for their organs because you might get caught and it might create a scandal that'll hurt organ donation in the long term, you'd probably say, no, you're just missing the point. Don't kill people for their organs because people deserve not to be treated in that way. Can utilitarians say that? It's not so clear that they can. Final reason to worry about utilitarianism, it seems like it asks too much of us. What do I mean by this? Well, most of us probably think there are certain things we could do that would be really nice, just wonderful, saintly actions, like say giving a kidney to a complete stranger. We think we'd be great people if we did it. We don't think that it's bad not to do it. Well, here's the problem. Utilitarianism seems to say that saintly actions like that aren't just above and beyond the call of duty. They're not just a nice thing to do that's not required. Utilitarians actually seem to say that we would be required, that we should give other people our organs, or we should give all our money to help others. We should make these huge personal sacrifices. Well, why? Let's take the case of an organ. If I have two healthy kidneys, it would cause me some pain. It would subject me to some risk to give away one of those to a person who needed a kidney transplant. But I would probably be okay in the long term. You only need one kidney to survive. And think about how much happiness it would create for the person who I give the kidney to. Or take money. Most of us, we could give a lot of our income to help people in the developing world. Some of them are starving, some of them don't have basic medical care. What am I going to spend my money on? Dinner, clothes, for anything I might spend money on, it could probably buy more happiness if I sent it to a charity that would help people in the developing world. But do most of us think we're bad people for not donating practically all of our money to charity? No. So any good moral theory, any halfway decent moral theory, is going to say that we should occasionally make sacrifices. If you find a wallet with $500 in it, any decent moral theory is going to say you should give it back to its owner. If you could get ahead at work by telling some awful lie about your competition, you shouldn't do that. That's fine and good. A moral theory should say that. But utilitarianism seems to ask that we make these incredible sacrifices, that we, give a kidney to a stranger, that we give all of our money away. Well, even though a moral theory might ask us to occasionally make sacrifices, how much should it ask of us? And it does seem to be a problem if that theory asks too much. And it seems in many cases utilitarianism might very well ask too much of us.